Hello and welcome to the CARE Challenges and Solutions for a Sustainable Future conference. I'm delighted to welcome you to session 60, which is focused on caring, society and policy. And I'd also like to welcome our first speaker for this session, Mary Larkin, who is Professor of Care, Carers and Caring at the Open University. Hello, Mary.
Hello, thank you. Well, I'm very pleased to be here today and have this opportunity to talk to you about the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence guidelines, which were published in 2020 on supporting adult carers. And on the next slide, you can see a link to where you can find these if you'd like to have a look at them, and they're actually referred to as the NICE guidelines, so I shall use that abbreviation throughout my presentation. But before I begin, I need to tell you briefly a bit about NICE and the guidelines so that you understand the context in which I'm talking. So on the next slide, I've got some information about NICE. It provides national evidence-based guidance and advice for health and public health and social care practitioners, and it's aiming to improve outcomes for people using the NHS and other public health and social care services. And it does this by developing quality standards and performance metrics for those who are providing commissioning health, public health and social care services. And it provides a range of information services for commissioners, practitioners and managers across health and social care. And it produces evidence-based recommendations developed by independent committees, such as the one that I was on and I'm going to speak to you about. And these include professionals and lay members, as well, academics, and there's extensive consultation with stakeholders as well. And with increasing service integration, the significance of NICE recommendations on social care are now equal to that of their counterparts in healthcare. Therefore, they're the most authoritative source of guidance for decisions and can inform future legislation. And it's highly significant for adult carer support that guidelines have been produced on this topic. So I'd like, on the next slide, to tell you a little about the development of these specific guidelines. We consulted with a wide range of stakeholders throughout the whole process. I put links in here if you're interested in finding more about these processes. We had several carers on the guideline committee. It started with a detailed scoping exercise, so we defined our population that we were going to deal with, and we also talked about the structure and the shape of the guideline and consulted with the stakeholders on that. So on the next slide, I've got the purpose of the guidelines. So we set out specifically to aim to improve the lives of all adult carers aged 18 or over. As many of you will know, that caring often takes its toll on carers, and they suffer in terms of their finances, their health and well-being, their employment and their social life. And we did this by identifying action-orientated good practice in providing support to enhance their well-being, resilience and their life experience. And it was because it was NICE guidelines, it was based on the best available evidence of effectiveness, and that included cost effectiveness, as well as including the views of carers and people using the services and practitioners. The next slide shows who it's actually for. And there's rather a long, daunting list here, but I just wanted to give you a flavour of the range of people that the guidelines are for. So you can see local authorities, clinical commissioning groups, and other organisations that assess and plan and commission local services or are involved in providing support and information for adult carers and people receiving care. And there's a list there of providers of health and social care services, and as you can see, last but not least, are actually the unpaid carers themselves. So this is for both those people in a paid position providing care, but also in an unpaid position providing care. So we identified we made 9 recommendations, and these are just outlined on the next few slides. So I'll give you a brief overview of each of the recommendations as I go through the next slides. Thank you. So the first two were around information support for carers and identifying carers. And the recommendations about information support for carers focused on the right of carers to information that is clear to them and suits their needs, and that information should be shared with carers as well. And also that those working organisations and practitioners working with carers should be honest and open with them and acknowledge them as expert partners in care and value their skills and knowledge about the person that they care for. The second recommendation, as many of you probably know, only about 7% of carers do self-identify. So therefore, we had some recommendations about improving the identification rate for carers. So we had recommendations for health and social care practitioners and for health and social care organisations that they come across. So for example, for organisations, we were encouraging them to look at their policies in terms of how they could enhance carer identification. The next recommendations are on the next slide, and recommendation 3 was around assessing carers' needs. We looked at some overarching principles for carers' assessments, making sure that they were carried out at a time in a place to suit the carers, that they were comfortable, took account of their working commitments as well. We also thought that these ought to that good preparation was critical to carrying out a carer's assessment, and that during these assessments that consideration should be given to work, education and training opportunities for carers so that they can either stay in work or education or return to it. And we also felt that after a carer's assessment there ought to be clearly identified outcomes that are made with the carer. The fourth recommendation is linked to the part of the assessment, that there should be a greater emphasis on helping carers to stay in and enter or return to work, education or training, and that carers should have tailored advice and support about balancing work and education or training, and that employers should be encouraged to be flexible in their working arrangements that they offer to carers, to enable them to balance caring and work, and that consideration should be given to replacement care for carers to enable them to go out to work. The fifth recommendation on the next slide is around community and social and community support for carers, and this emphasised the importance of giving carers information about community support and advice that's available and how to access it, that health practitioners should regularly discuss with carers about the value of having breaks and helping them to develop their resilience, and the value of peer support, because this was found to be really valued. The evidence showed that this was found to be really invaluable to carers. And there was also evidence, also a recommendation about extending support for carers once they finish caring. Often these people are often known as former carers, and many of them experience what are called the legacies of carers. So we thought it was important to embrace the whole caring journey, and including its impact afterwards within these guidelines. And the last part of this, the fifth recommendation, was that local authorities should offer advocacy services and information about how to access advocacy support services to carers. Recommendation 6, training to provide care and support. This was mainly focused on carer training programs to help them, for example, prepare for transitions or future planning, and also that carers should be trained in the use of equipment and adaptations and moving and handling. The last 3 recommendations are on the next slide. And as you can see, the 7th was psychological and emotional support for carers, that carers should be able to access psychological and psychoeducational support within the community, and that if carers had an identified mental health need, that consideration should be given to offering them psychotherapy and counselling. The 8th recommendation was about support during changes to the caring role. Carers often need a lot of support around the time when the person they care for, their health deteriorates significantly, and also when carers' circumstances change themselves. For example, an older carer who may feel they can no longer provide the level of support that they're providing. And last but not least, the 9th recommendation was about support for carers during end-of-life care and after the person dies. The recommendation specified that there should be relevant information and support that is sensitive to their needs. They should be encouraged to engage with advanced care planning and understand their role in that advanced care. And they should also be given help in line with other NICE guidelines about care at the end of the life, for example, the giving of medication and the importance of dignity and respect for the person that they're caring for. So I'd just like to, on the next few slides, think about some of the implications of these guidelines. They do make a significant and cost-effective contribution towards making caring sustainable for carers, improving their health and well-being, and helping them to continue caring alongside all the other commitments in their lives, and leading in turn to better care for the person they're caring for. And I mentioned they were cost effective. We made considerable efforts to ensure they're cost effective in terms of the way they call for refinements to existing practice, but they don't imply any costly changes or radical new provision. And the guidelines have done this by several overarching principles, which came through when I was discussing each of the recommendations. The emphasis on making sure information is accurate and detailed, it's easier for carers to understand and retain, encouraging the carer in their role and respecting them as a core team member, as an expert in their own right, improving the quality of discussions between practitioners and carers, encouraging a more open approach, improving coordination between the different bodies involved, like local authorities and other health and social care organisations, in identifying carers and giving them support, reinforcing carers' statutory rights to help them improve, and this should improve consistency of best practice and reduce some of the regional differences in provision that we see in the UK and in other countries, obviously, as well. And encouraging commissioners to develop local markets so that replacement care is available to purchase as an option. And also providing flexibility for working carers. We saw that in some of the later recommendations. And another contribution the guidelines make to sustaining caring arrangements with wellbeing outcomes for carers are its recommendations for research, which are on the next slide. And there were 5 recommendations. The details are given under each one, but just to give you an overview, there was we felt there needed to be more research on whole family approaches to care assessments, and more research on support for carers to return to work, employment or training. There ought to be more research on training for carers to reduce caring-related incidents. And on the next slide, it's got the other recommendations. Practical support through carer passport schemes, which are growing in popularity and are evaluated extremely positively, and practical support for carers through social prescribing. So, although we've come to appreciate carers much more over the last year because of the pandemic, these guidelines can be seen as a comprehensive evidence-based attempt at supporting adults who are caring, and hopefully be part of the drive to ensure that carers receive the best possible support and information, both now and when the pandemic is hopefully further behind us. So thank you very much. And the last slide explains about where you can find it, and these are my views and not necessarily of NICE themselves.
Thank you, Mary. That was a really fascinating presentation. And as you say, the past year has really underscored the importance of carers and making sure they're supported. And it's also, if you look at the numbers, it's also increased the number of people identifying as carers. So it's an ever more pressing policy. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'd like to now turn to our next presentation, which is from Liliya Zenina, who's a doctoral researcher at the University of Jyväskylä, and also a research at the Centre of Excellence for AgeCare in Finland.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me here. I'm investigating projects that recently have been developed by non-profit organizations in different regions of Russia and target older people. The COVID-19 pandemic affected my research plans and raised concerns about health and well-being of older people. In media, older people and people with disabilities were addressed as vulnerable group. Thus, I started questioning how are older people with disabilities supported by the government and non-profit organizations? And more specifically, are there any differences in their approaches? Next slide, please. To give some background information, on the 1st January of 2020, there were about 7 million people above 60 years with different types of disabilities, and more specifically, about 3,800 pensioners with visual disabilities. Next slide, please. In Russia, there were periods of national lockdowns, for instance, April-May 2020, across different regions. Measures differed. For instance, some months in Moscow, people above 65 were not only recommended but restricted to leave their residences. Also, government ordered to move older people above 65 to remote work on the priority basis. So people above 65 were kind of united in one group, and they were called group of high risk and experienced the biggest restrictions. The next slide, please. Meanwhile, to support people in difficult situations through activities of non-profit organizations, the Presidential Grant Foundation organized the special grant competition and provided money to local organizations that have expertise and know the best their localities. For the purpose of my research, I selected 223 projects out of 900 winners based on mentioning older people in their targeting groups. What I want to highlight that out of projects that target people with disabilities, the majority of projects offered target social assistance, including free meals, help with household errands. Besides psychological and medical help were provided, patronage services. I found 2 schools of family long-term care. Also, seniors could attend online sport activities. The biggest sum in this competition transferred to the Enjoyable Aging Charity Foundation, is one of the main actors that develop long-term care currently in Russia. So under this project, Enjoyable Aging Charity Foundation provided help to 7,500 people in 20 facilities in 15 regions, predominantly people of older age with disability, also without disability, by engaging social and medical workers to the facilities and through purchasing special equipment. The next slide, please. Moscow, it's a bit a special case because in Moscow currently the largest number of older people with disability live. So since middle of March 2020, mass events were cancelled, and courses of Moscow Longevity Project also moved online. This Moscow Longevity Project, it's a huge state project that provide opportunities for seniors for socialization and for cultural events, for different courses, all free of charge. However, the question about classes for people with visual disability is still open. During 2020, the Moscow government published the news that now possibilities to get a trained dog for people with visual disabilities available. Also, the government organized a hotline for people with hearing impairments. In 2020, home care services provision were a bit altered beneficially for people who in need of home care, and about 30 million social services were provided for people in need. Next slide, please. Anyway, the pandemic revealed the problems and attracted attention to it. Simultaneously, the situation has led to new solutions and reconsideration of values. During the pandemic, I got to know the concept extrability. Explaining this concept, I should say that extrability develops in the situation when a person experiencing limitations and in case of successful socialization. On the slides, you can see some examples of extrabilities for persons with visual disabilities. This concept promoted by the White Can, non-governmental, non-profit organizations from Yekaterinburg. They actively develop this concept with universities and do very interesting projects. For instance, for the last 10 years, they organized Sail of the Spirit. It's inclusive yachting involving people with different types of disabilities, so also older people. Also, during the COVID, they organized hybrid excursions where guides were people with disabilities, and this excursion can be accessible with all people with different disabilities and without. Next slide, please. I conducted interview with the president of this White Can organization. He told me that they engage older people and make projects to help to recover people with addiction. So seniors help people recovering addictions. While interviewing the president of this organization, we found out that extrability of older people is still an open question and must be further investigated. However, what is important that experience of seniors must be used in unusual for them way to get interesting and useful results. That hobbies, interest, health of seniors must be considered, and that all interaction, all inclusive interaction must be organized in such a way that all people gain something good, positive, that they have very positive, good experience, gain knowledge and skills. The next slide, please. Several days after the interview, I participated with group meeting with White Can president also. We have not expected, but more than 80 pensioners, Moscow pensioners, were involved. And during our talk, we tried to figure out what are extrabilities, so what they think about pandemic. And as a result, people highlighted their concentration on their own wishes, on their own desires. They talk about calm reaction to external events. And also they highlighted consciousness of their joy. So probably it's examples of their extra abilities, but this question should be further investigated. So I'm planning other meetings with pensioners in form of group interviews to investigate this question further. Next slide, please. Afterwards, keeping in mind my question about support of people with disabilities, fascinated by this concept of extra ability, I contacted several non-profit organizations that deal with older people with disabilities, and also experts from a university and museum, and also one activist. So the project's still ongoing, but I want to share with you some insights. So while interviewing the musician activist, he has visual disabilities, and he is about 59 years old. He said that he is a very happy person, and he actually organized concerts outside the hospital for people to cheer them up, and he got very positive feedback. And currently the musician is busy with his artistic plan. Anyway, it's absolutely another approach. The next slide, please. So also I want to highlight some things that came up during the interviews. So all people highlighted depressive moods and anxiety of people with disabilities who participate in different projects. Also, organizations themselves had to alter their plans. However, all experts, all participants mention and highlight the great importance of communication and socialization for older people with and without disabilities. All people acknowledge heterogeneity of older people. It was also mentioned the need to advance technology. However, the problem appears. So not all older people with disabilities have special gadgets and equipment to be online, to be in touch. So organizations were busy to provide this gadget and to teach older people to use them properly. What's interesting and important that people start highlighted a different value of their relationship, their value of time. Several times a very important issue came up about older people rights, that the government providing some restrictions limit older people rights, and it should be further discussed and investigated. The last slide, please. Anyway, I have some preliminary conclusion that all actors that support older people with disabilities have been developing new solutions. A lot of projects went online, and organization, non-governmental, governmental, they were busy, and many of them successfully implemented online solutions. I should say that applying recommendation, the state sometimes act paternalistically, because it restricted, not just recommended, the way of living of older people. Older people were addressed and united in one homogeneous group, even though some people above 65 could have excellent health. Anyway, they were united in one group. Non-governmental, non-profit organizations, they highlight importance of supporting and cheer up people. However, some organizations, non-profit organizations, who are very tight with the government, they develop very specific projects that are in line with the governmental approach, and so there is the specifics of interaction with the government. Anyway, all experts, they highlight the importance to keep in mind hobbies of people, and it's the right way to make their socialization successful. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Liliya. That was a really fascinating presentation, and I think there certainly are parallels to some of the discussions we had here in the UK around the idea that older people are a homogenous group and should be subject to the same restrictions during the COVID pandemic. And there are just debates here unravelling around not just being older, but also being older in residential care, and that making people subject to certain things like blanket do not resuscitate orders, because automatically they were all classed as being extremely vulnerable. But thank you very much. I'd like to now turn to our next presenter, who is Maria Cheshire-Allen, who is a PhD candidate from the Centre for Ageing and Dementia Research at Swansea University. Hello, Maria.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, I'm Maria. I'm a PhD candidate, and I'm also a researcher at the Centre for Ageing and Dementia Research. And just to begin, really, I'm going to talk to you briefly about some of my headline results based on my work for my fieldwork for my PhD that took place during the spring and summer of 2020, just at the beginning of the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic in Wales. So next slide, please. So just to give you an overview, I'll just sort of broadly locate this work within a bigger context and just explain how this idea of carer well-being is quite a significant policy issue now, which leads me to my research question, which is really looking at what can we understand about family care through this concept or idea of well-being. So I'm really sort of using well-being as a demonstrator concept, really, to extrapolate some of the normative frameworks and try to understand the implications for family carers. And this is a qualitative study, very much informed by a political ethics of care approach. And then I'm going to just touch upon some of the key results, some of the key themes that have come out from the fieldwork and from the systematic literature review, some of the themes of codependence, lifelines lost, and positives of care, which builds towards my sort of core argument, really, based on the findings that we need an expanded conceptualization of well-being that allows for this idea of relational personhood. Okay, so next slide, please. So just to locate the work within the broader context, we know that family carers are the primary givers of care and support in the UK, and that this is in part due to a combination of factors, including population ageing, lower fertility rates, family structural changes, and increases in female labour market participation, as well as, and importantly, significant cuts to welfare social care budgets. So more and more people depend upon unpaid carers, friends, family and neighbours, which has kind of led to a broader mainstream narrative that describes a crisis of care in the UK and beyond, and really is reinforced to some extent by some of the empirical academic literature that has unequivocally suggested, really, that there is a burden of care, that people who care can come at significant cost across all sorts of domains, including physical health, mental health, family relations and finances. So really, as Mary said, the care comes at a significant cost, and in COVID-19 as well, family carers can be seen as particularly susceptible to these negative wellbeing outcomes. And my work is really looking at whether wellbeing can help us understand the experiences of unpaid care. So next slide, please. So my work is also very much focused and located within a strong policy context where we see wellbeing as used as an organising principle in which social care services are arranged and delivered in the UK. And in part, this is due to the Stiglitz report that emphasised the need to measure social as well as economic measures of well-being. And in Wales, we've had quite a long history of including well-being in our policy discourse. International acclaim has been given to the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, and we have an associated commissioner. But my work is really focused on the Social Services and Wellbeing Act that attributed new rights, as did the Care Act in England, that gave new rights to carers, so that every local authority in Wales has a duty to carry out a carer's needs assessment that has this overarching principle of promoting well-being. And I think as well, everyone recognises that during the context and in the context of COVID-19, care has been central to how we are responding and how we potentially build back from this crisis. So next slide, please. So just to give you an overview of my method and theoretical approach, the work took place within 2 stages, beginning with a purposive literature review that was very much theory driven and, like I said, informed by this political ethics of care approach that is mainly a leading theorist of Joan Tronto and others, and also I've been very influenced by the human capabilities approach by Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum. And then in terms of the conceptualization or definition of well-being, I've used McGregor and Powell's multi-dimensional definition, which identifies 3 broad domains of well-being: material, relational, and subjective. And then bringing those 2 ideas together, the idea of well-being and care, there's actually been very limited work done in this area, particularly in relation to older people's care and carers. And Cunningham have carried out a literature review relating to carers of older people living with dementia. And their results found that the theoretical foundations were very limited in scope, mainly based upon a burden discourse of care, and none of the empirical studies that they identified actually addressed the interaction between extrinsic well-being factors such as material goods and intrinsic well-being factors such as subjective effects. So really I'm trying to address that knowledge gap in my work. And then the second stage took place, I received ethical approval to carry out field work with 30 carers of older people living in Wales, and I carried out qualitative semi-structured interviews. All of the people that I interviewed were family relations, and I used a combination of inductive and deductive analysis. So moving on to the findings now, on our next slide. So I've used the broad domains of well-being identified by McGregor and Paul to sort of structure some of the analysis and some of the work. Subjective well-being, we come to this first idea of agency and dependence and codependence. So I asked every participant, what does well-being mean to them as a carer? And overwhelmingly, all of my participants described well-being very much in relational terms to the person that they're caring for. So this quote here, if I'm not happy and okay, then she's not going to be happy and okay. And this idea of codependence, or this idea of relational personhood, is very much in keeping with this ethics of care approach, but actually runs counter to this individualized notion of well-being that we find in the broad policy of care and well-being, which emphasizes people's individual rights. And then I kind of explored this a little bit further in terms of the COVID-19 pandemic and the restrictions that people were having to live under. And many people described how they felt their subjective well-being had been negatively impacted because there was no room for them to be able to express their personhood through care and connect through care. And one person described how she was feeling really anxious and stressed because she was no longer able to just have any physical contact with her father, just to give him a kiss on the top of his head and he's happy for the day. So just moving on to the next slide, and some further themes relating to subjective well-being came through with the ideas of responsibility and balance. And many carers actually described how they, because of the fear of bringing the virus into the home, had cancelled care packages. And really, they described how this wasn't an option if going forward again, because of such negative impact that this had on their well-being. So having those support structures in place were absolutely essential. And then also many of them described conflict and turmoil relating to how to navigate the correct or the right course of action. And one carer said, do I insist, this was very early on in the lockdown, do I insist that the carers who come into the home wear PPE? And then also the issues around how to negotiate telling your own family that they can't see their own mum. So in the context of COVID-19, I think we can really see that idea of individual rational choice making really not being applicable in the context of care, and that care, as argued by an ethics of care perspective, is very much a moral everyday concern. So moving on now to an additional theme on our next slide, please, relating to material well-being. And as I described, people talked about having to cancel or not receive any care support. And these are expressed in terms of lifelines and that impact upon their actual subjective well-being. But just on this second quote here, one lady described to me how her medical visits for the person that had been cared for were being cancelled, and how that actually put the person being cared for and her at a great risk. And she was worried that when she took the support stockings off, she was causing more harm. So here we can see that even rejecting and having those services not given to them anymore actually left carers at significant risk, which raises some really important but difficult questions, I think, relating to ideas of social justice. And what can carers be reasonably expected to do? And can really is it justifiable in this context for carers to be left to go it alone? So finally, just on this issue of social justice, in our next slide, overwhelmingly, carers did describe deep personal struggles and sacrifices that they were having to deal with in the context of COVID and previously. And despite this, though, I also heard of many reports of carers saying that they were still able to identify and recognise positive aspects of care. And in this quote here, she's saying that she feels satisfied. And these ideas of personal reward, self-gratification, and feelings of doing good really came through very strongly in the majority of carers. So I kind of tried to drill down on this a little bit further and explore these ideas in the interviews. And it came through very clearly that carers actually felt invisible and unrecognised and undervalued. So the carers that I spoke to felt that they were, and this quote here really sort of shows how she was pitching herself against the paid carers, who in Wales did receive a £500 extra, a bonus during the pandemic, and there's been further monetary support for paid carers. But she felt as an unpaid carer, as a family carer, very angry and irate because she didn't choose the job. So trying to explain and make sense of all of this, I think an ethics of care approach, an analysis of well-being can really help us. So my ideas are sort of running along the theme of well-being is theorised and measured as an individual notion, and within this broader context of burden and crisis. And really, I think this has directed attention away from the inevitable dependencies or inevitable vulnerability that we all as human beings experience throughout our lives, and can be seen as amplifying a discourse of burden in relation to specifically older people and the care of older people. And in the context of COVID, perhaps this also can serve to marginalise, obscure and devalue family care, and even provide the justification for withdrawing all the support services, all the lifelines that carers really do rely on. So just to finish then and conclude, on my next slide, please. Overall, carers agreed overwhelmingly that they see their choices and their capacity to realise their own well-being very much in connected terms, so very much in relation to the person that they're caring for. So really rejecting that idea of individual rational choice making. And I think this can help us really start highlighting the issue of care as a question of social justice, and then the difficult questions of to what extent is it reasonable to leave carers to fend essentially for themselves. And then finally, some ideas I'm working on at the moment on extending and expanding this idea of well-being within the context of unpaid care, and really my suggestions are really beginning this idea of well-being in care based on this idea of relational personhood. And I think this can help challenge the burden and individualism of care, and also help us to recognise the inherent structural inequalities that carers often begin with, and help argue for the need to support carers. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Maria. That was really, really interesting. And I liked how you highlighted the impact of the additional care carers were providing during the pandemic, because they were going it alone where services were restricted or scaled back, but also the impact of not being able to provide care and well-being, on that relational well-being, when touch was prohibited or caring visits were scaled back for family members. I think that was a really important point to raise. And also there was something that sparked a thought in my mind around the importance of relationality and former carers, and it chimes in with Mary's guidelines, including former carers in support. What happens when that caring role ends, and if your well-being is bound up with relationally, and that caring relationship comes to an end, what happens then? I think that's something really interesting as well. I'd like to now ask Patrick Hall to come and act as a discussant to bring together some thoughts on these presentations. Patrick is a research fellow at the University of Birmingham. Over to you.
Thank you, Kate. First of all, a huge thanks to our speakers today for a fascinating set of presentations, and also to Xander, Kelly, Dan and the rest of the team that have made this session and the conference possible. Lots to reflect on. I think the COVID-19 crisis has made care for older and disabled people across the world, in some ways much more visible. Domiciliary care homes, supported housing solutions, as OT pointed out there, and their vital workforce have entered into our national policy and political debates around the world. The indispensable nature of family care, neighbourhood support has really come to the fore here in the UK, not only in its presence in response to the crisis, but also in its absence, as we have been forcibly isolated from our friends and our family and the support and relationships that we have with them. Importantly, this world of support, what you might call a foundational economy, has become visible to a new generation of people, perhaps who would have been out in offices, who are now, working from home and very much seeing the care and support that's provided in communities. The shadow work, which was identified by Ivan Illich nearly 40 years ago, has perhaps emerged partly from the shadows. The state has achieved many things in response to the outbreak, but in many ways has been shown to be deeply deficient in its response to the needs of older and disabled people, as a number of the presentations have highlighted. In many places, mutual support in neighbourhoods and local institutions, so NGOs, faith groups, cultural groups, groups organised on social media and so on, have emerged to respond to perceived need. Without them, the toll of the crisis could have been much higher in a number of ways. One of these tolls has been the further isolation and further institutionalization of adults living in care homes and supported living arrangements. Oti's presentation alerts us to the experiences of this institutionalization, the diminished sense of home, and over-reliance on technology to meet our social and relational needs, something which we can all sympathise with, and the need to learn from this, the impact of socialisation as a result of the lockdowns that we've seen all over the world, have in many ways yet to be reckoned with. There are emergent concepts in social care policy and scholarship and practice which attempt to recognise and counter some of the institutionalising tendencies in social care delivery. These concepts will be invaluable as we emerge from the crisis and we attempt to retain the vitality of mutual support and counter this loss of home. That in England, an influential concept in social care policy, alongside well-being, as Maria points out, are kind of asset-based and strengths-based approaches, which in some ways have been adapted from kind of communitarian currents in the US and approaches to sustainable community development. That's become an influential concept. Liliya draws our attention to something which I think could be a complementary concept: extrability. I'd not come across it before, so it's really interesting to hear more about its use in Russia. But I really think that this is a complementary concept to these approaches of strengths and asset-based working, as they focus on the unique talents and skills of people, including those who are perceived to be characterized by some lack, deficit, or need. Future sustainability for care systems must include the mobilization of these gifts. So while the state might not be the appropriate delivery mechanism of care and support in some situations, it retains a vital role in supporting informal and unpaid work of carers. Maria's presentation, based on really, really up-to-date work, which is based on the experiences of this crisis, is a fantastic reflection on the need to care for those who care. There are not these two easily definable groups: those who need care and those who supply it, of the vulnerable and invulnerable. In fact, that's what makes our area of study so interesting, is that really it's about relationships. And I do hope that her work is recognised, and look forward to reading more about how policy might incorporate these more relational concepts of well-being in the future. And as Maria says, caring costs. There is a very real sense that caring costs in terms of well-being, and carers have felt abandoned during this crisis. One of the key lessons must be that the levers of reform and practice are used to identify them, to recognise what they do, and to effectively support their well-being and relationships with others, and to build an infrastructure of support that can be a sustainable support to them. And this brings us back to our first presentation. Mary's excellent description of the work that NICE is doing to begin this process of supporting carers as we emerge from the crisis. It is, vital work in that, busy professionals must have accessible resources which summarise the work that's done by social scientists. And this is a great example of guidance which can provide a roadmap for commissioners and other frontline professionals in local government and the NHS and elsewhere. One of the key lessons must be that the levers of reform and practice, in assessment, the provision of advocacy, the provision of information, and in direct service delivery are used to recognise and effectively support the well-being of carers. Just a few questions for our panel related to this. So I wonder if you agree with me that informal care has become more visible as a result of the COVID-19 crisis. I wonder how we might build on this increased visibility of care in our societies, how we might maintain it. Just another question to the panel is, do you think COVID-19 and the crisis around it has changed the priorities of social care reform? Is there anything that we've learned during this crisis that might be used to inform new iterations of social care reform in our respective countries? Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. That was really well summarised and some interesting questions. I'd just like to now bring the panel back and perhaps start with any questions of clarification that you have for each other. And if there aren't, perhaps we could start with Patrick's questions. So the first one being around the visibility of informal care and how we then, whether we think that the COVID pandemic has made it more visible, and if so, how do we capitalise on this? How do we build on it, really? So maybe I'll turn to Mary first.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, sadly, it's an effect, isn't it, of COVID, that the visibility of unpaid care has been raised. But that could be used to a positive effect. I mean, it's not what we wanted to happen to people in order to raise it, the profile, if you see what I mean. But I think because the carers in the UK, there were 15% of population with carers pre-COVID, and it's now 26%. So it's an increase of nearly 50%. But more people are doing it. We get presented with these figures more in the media. I think we should capitalise on this in order to continue to raise the profile of carers, and also to encourage more people to self-identify, because apparently it's estimated something like only 7% of carers actually do self-identify, which is just incredibly low. And if they don't self-identify, they can't access the support that excellent guidelines like the NICE guidelines have worked so hard to shape into the best possible form. So I think we should use this. If this is anything good that's going to come out of this, I think we should use it to increase the rate of identification of informal carers.
I think it's very timely as well, because we've just had the census in the UK, which included a question on caring for the first time since 2011.
They have had one since 2001, but they refined it much more. Yes,
So hopefully people will self-identify in that, and we can see what the state of caring is like.
The trouble is, some people might be a carer, but they see, it goes back to Maria's point about the relational aspects of caring, and that if you're in a caring dyad like spousal caring, so many people say, well, I'm just a husband, or I'm just a wife, I'm not a carer. So it's a question of how they see themselves, and chipping away at that, in terms of getting them to openly identify.
Yes, yeah, and this is perhaps where the pandemic might shift those things. If services had to be replaced by those spousal carers, those formal services which are formally defined as care, that then, if you're then doing the tasks of a formal carer would have been doing, maybe that helps highlight it. I don't know. I think that remains to be seen. Thank you. I'd like to now take the same question to Liliya, around how you would reflect on whether COVID has highlighted the role of informal carers and what we can do then to drive the agenda forward.
I believe that support on informal caregiver will get more attention, and informal caregiver will be supported in different way. For instance, during 2020, but a bit before, the Russian government has started to develop measures to assist informal caregivers, and some special schools and services were organized, so social care workers now can also assist to informal caregivers. I also do believe that informal caregiver got more value, attention. So because during the COVID, people were limited in their communication, and I think that a lot of people, especially who are in need of in-home care, they reconsider the value, the input of their family partners, friends, their informal caregivers. So I think it's at some extent like positive outcome of the COVID. And as I said, that the government started to pay more attention how to protect informal caregivers, how to support them, and develop new programs as well. It's actually also affected the third sector, so non-profit organizations. They also by different means got involved to support an informal caregiver, and I can clearly see it by analyzing projects in different regions. So as I can say, more value, more assistance, more support.
Mary, did you have a question for Liliya?
If I could just come back, please. And thank you for your presentation. It was really interesting. In the UK, over a third of unpaid carers are over 65. And I was interested in your population looking at older people. Did you identify any that were actually caring themselves for somebody else, like an elderly parent? And any issues for them?
Yes, sure. I mean, it's another topic, to discuss this kind of relationship and this type of informal care. But through my analysis, I can see the need, the demand of support of such kind of informal caregiving. And I found out some projects. I just highlighted one grant competition, but also analyzed several thousands projects like across different regions. And I can see that this issue exists, and I see also positive changes. So in supporting and assisting by different means. But yeah, it's a bit different topic, I do believe.
Yeah, I was just interested. Thank you.
Thanks. Maria, did you want to, I mean, your presentation really did draw out some of the implications for carers around COVID-19, but do you think the visibility, is it more now, and how do we take it forward?
I certainly think that there is an increased visibility and recognition because of COVID, and we can, numerically count how many more people are caring because of the pandemic. But I'm not sure if that is translated into an increase in value of unpaid care. And I think that's, all related to the whole issue of not recognising our inherent need to care, and actually going a bit further than that and saying our right to care. We could extend this further into a sort of rights discourse and see where that goes. So I think, yeah, we certainly can see positives from the pandemic in terms of being able to identify and recognise care, but I'm not sure whether the value of care will actually increase. I think what's been really positive is that with more people talking about care and having to care, because that's another issue, is the issue of choice and freedom to care. But in the pandemic, more people have had to care, and I think from the results that I am reflecting on, there's so many people are saying that I can still find positives in care, not in the pandemic, and that those positives can be recognised if we can value care more. And we keep talking about care as a burden and as in crisis, and that makes it very difficult. And that's why I think wellbeing can be quite an interesting concept to use. So whether it translates into the second part of your question, Patrick, about political action and change, I'm a little bit sceptical at the moment. I think there needs to be some much more sort of transformative things happening. I don't have the answers to, but from my various findings, I think it's this whole idea of value, the value of care, which we've got such a long history in the scholarship about. And I think the feminist ethics of care approach can be really helpful to sort of help unravel.
Yeah, and your presentation touched on the sort of £500 bonus that paid care workers received, and then it's well documented how poorly remunerated they are. But there, on the other hand, we have unpaid carers for whom carers allowance is one of the lowest benefits you can get in the UK, and it's not. There is that disparity in the monetary value of care, as well as just the esteem around it, I think.
And care is following
Sorry, carry on, Maria.
I was just going to say that care follows social stratification lines. That you're more likely to care and be in poverty, and those issues as well. Those structural inequalities that mean that often those who are caring and having the hardest time are often also the more likely not to be heard. And I think there's all those issues as well around it, that the pandemic has helpfully highlighted all these existing inequalities and the uneven playing field that so many people experience. But again, whether there's enough transformative power behind this agenda, I'm not sure.
Mary, you have something?
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to pick up. Maria rightly made the distinction between increasing the visibility versus the value of carers. Oti made the point that we have to also need to consider public finances. So, we might have increased the visibility of caring, but whether that translates into actual more effective services for carers is another matter, because there's huge swinging cuts, even more with social care budgets, and that's why I mean, obviously the NICE guidelines try to be cost effective, but if, you know, they would, from a baseline, improving what's there, but if what's there gets chopped or reduced, it's going to be hard to implement those with the best will in the world. So I think we need to put it all in the context of public finances following the pandemic.
Yes, Patrick, did you want to come in, or?
Yeah, I mean that is the you know, the elephant in the room with all kind of discussions about improvements to policy in practice. You know, is the particularly in the UK, it isn't a universal experience, I suppose, of, you know, the cuts, particularly over the past 15 years to local government expenditure. And, you know, I do think that, there are new discussions being had about, you know, potential sustainable funding settlements for social care in the UK, and I do hope that the increased visibility, not just of informal care, but of all care, you know, services and commissioning and delivery. I think the increased visibility does open up a political space for the potential for a sustainable funding settlement in the UK. Of course, there's the complication of the devolution settlements in the four nations of the UK to doing that in Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland, and the process has to be led from the UK government. And I think there are some examples of where this increased visibility is leading to a discussion within government at the moment. But, you know, there are a number of different veto players, particularly the UK Treasury, which might prevent this from going forward. Recently, there was a report by Demos, which I contributed to, which is by Danny Kruger MP, called The Care Commitment, which discusses potential avenues for a sustainable care funding settlement in the UK. So I'd say have a look at that as an example of some of the ideas that are emerging in conservative circles, and of course there are alternative approaches which are emerging politically across the board. But yeah, I don't know. I think Maria is probably right to have a certain sense of pessimism about translating this sense of visibility into political action, given our experience of the past 30, 40 years of kind of drift on overall funding reform. But that shouldn't stop us from continuing to talk about and to build on the visibility of social care during this crisis, as it may be one of the few positive things that comes out of this crisis.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yeah. And maybe we could go. This leads quite nicely into the next question that you had around. Okay, has it changed our priorities? What do we take forward from this? Not just thinking about informal carers, but more broadly about the care system. How do we move forward? We've seen, asset-based, strength-based approaches where different groups have been brought into the social care arena. What do we take forward from that, but in a way that achieving a balance, so it's not just the rollback of statutory services, because
absolutely.
They've coped, they've done it well. Carry on. And similarly, I guess, so who would like to talk a bit about that and what our priorities should be moving forward?
I think what's come through from the talks this morning is the need to recognise our social needs in terms of our social care reform priorities. We are generally looking at a very biomedical model, and I think OTU highlighted that quality of life was the same or okay, but social needs and social wellbeing measures had diminished. And that's really what my findings are also saying. People are surviving, but they certainly aren't having their social needs attended to. So I guess this translates into more mental health services, and particularly if we're looking at the older population and older family carers, there's some real issues there in terms of capacity and discrimination. So those sort of specifics I would really like to see, sort of part of a package of reform. I think as well we've definitely seen the non-governmental organisations, the voluntary sector being able to be, as we know, particularly agile, particularly fast-footed, able to respond in a way that local authorities just have not and cannot. I mean, when I've spoken to the voluntary groups that I work with, and the people who are ringing into the groups looking for support, some of them in desperate need, saying that they ring in these helplines and they're ringing directly through to the local authority, and it's just an answer phone. They cannot get the medical visits, they cannot get the social care visits, they can't get any support, whereas the NGO sector has been able to not fill necessarily those essential services, but certainly provide something. So again, those thorny issues of providing sustainable support to the NGO sector that's basically often just doing what the local authorities used to be doing. I think that's highlighted another huge area that again I would like to see in any social care reform package, regardless of the pandemic. And the pandemic has demonstrated that very clearly, I think.
And I think that was something that came up through in Liliya's presentation, was the very paternalistic approaches taken by policy versus the sort of more nuanced approaches NGOs could take. So there's lessons that NGOs can, in terms of the more, as you say, fleet-footed, more responsive services they can provide, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the whole onus should be those services to provide it, because the issue of sustainability, I think, is key there.
Exactly.
Thank you for pointing this out. Actually, I was thinking that extraordinary concept is positioning is a new concept that should replace medical model and social model. It's new way of building up exclusive society for all, and actually it should affect the way how social services system is built up. So it should be accessible for all people. For instance, as we think about people with disabilities, visual disabilities and hair impairment, like simultaneously, how easy they can access to social services. So I think that this pandemic actually revealed the problem of exclusion of some group of people. Also, it highlighted issue of older people rights and ageism that appear, for instance, how recommendations were formulated by the government, by the states, and also to the previous discussion when we were talking about state and people who need care and informal caregivers. I think that we should not exclude business. For instance, currently in Russia, fund competition organized by big business organizations like Potanin Funds, Fund of Timchenko, and they actively support not only non-profit organizations, but initiative groups. Initiative groups, when older people come together, they don't need to make like a formal organization, but anyway, they get supported and they can develop their like grassroots initiatives. So, and it's important for well-being of older people, for like building coherent society, that social services a system and like policymakers, they should not only kind of keep applying only this top-down approach that somebody decide what's good for everyone, but take into consideration like real demands. So it's actually, I think that the pandemic actually revealed this issue of communication between policymakers and people in need, how they want the care be provided. Yes.
Mary.
Yeah, I agree with that point. And I agree with the points made about how NGOs stepped up and the flexibility and the advantage of them. But also going forward, we need to make sure that there aren't disparities and variations in the sort of care that people have, which so often happens when you've got a more piecemeal approach to care. And linked to that, you know, if we, I mean, a lot of what's come out today is that, like, individual efforts people have made, like friends and neighbours, and you know, if we had a more caring society that valued older people and was more proactive, you know, I'm not abdicating the state of its responsibilities, but I just think, you know, we need to give serious consideration to actually how we all think about the health, the support we give people who need care. And it's all our responsibility. We're not just responsible for our own family, relatives, and friends that we know.
So this relational idea actually expanding to beyond, you know, just kinship to wider communities. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. But again, that depends if you're part of a community. If you live in a rural area and you're isolated, yeah, there's obviously key issues there.
Yes, and I think the pandemic there are examples, but it's not everywhere, of communities in rural places, but stepping in and forming networks. But as you say, the disparity must be quite stark for some places.
Yeah, sure.
I wondered now if we wanted to give an opportunity for the presenters to ask each other questions about their presentations. So maybe we start with, has anyone got any questions for Mary about her presentation?
I've got a question for Mary, just about the process. I once worked for the Social Care Institute for Excellence on some of the social care guidance, and I was just wondering if you could talk a bit more about how, you know, the experiences of carers informs the guidance, because obviously you're building on evidence that's out there, but is there a process of kind of involving people in the production of the guidance itself?
Oh yeah, very much so. Right from the beginning. I mean, we had, I think I mentioned we had carers on the guideline committee, and carers were involved in putting forward the brief for the guidelines, and the main carers organisations were consulted as well. And then now at the moment, I haven't been involved in this because I just hadn't got the time, but they're sent out for consultation as well. So again, carers have a chance to have a look at, and the carers organisation. And carers have been involved in developing the quality standards that have come out of them as well. So yeah, very much all the way through. I mean, it's the first guideline committee I'd ever been on, and I was really impressed at how rigorous they were at representation of those for whom the guidelines were intended. And it was a really interesting experience.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Mary? Okay, shall we turn to Liliya? Any questions for Liliya about her presentation?
I'm really interested in your the concept of extra ability, and just wondered how much, whether you could expand upon it a bit more, and how much it is is it part of a mainstream discourse, or is it still quite a niche understanding of things?
Thank you for the question. So it's the concept that quite recently has emerged, like for several years. However, it attracted already experts not only from Russian universities or NGO, but also from other countries like Israel, Germany, Nepal, and like actually it's the list of countries because White Can NGO is quite active in popularization. They also attracted experts from the university and publish monographies that explain this concept and real practical cases. This concept were implemented. The big thing here, I think that in this concept, people put on the first place. And also what's important in this concept, like people who popularized this concept, they say that people can choose whether they are with disability or whether they are with extra ability. So it's another positioning of people, like another way of thinking. And yeah, it's pretty much psychological help and assistance for people with disabilities. And I'm quite fascinated with this concept because I see many ways how it can be implemented on the way to build up this coherent society, not excluded group of people. Because for now, when we were talking about COVID, for instance, people above 65, they were like united into one group and they were like split it up from, other people. And it's not right because people above 65, it's not one like homogeneous group. And it's affect the way how measures are implemented, the way how recommendations are implemented. And what I want to say, like referring to Marie talk that about recommendations that were developed by experts, I start thinking how important when the government take into consideration expert opinion and practical knowledge, because I can see some examples when the government, without expertise, implement some decisions and consequences of this decision, and otherwise, how, for instance, in Finland, after experts influence the way how recommendation for older people were formulated and published and developed. So it's very important when expert opinion, knowledge takes into consideration. And I think it's a huge problem still, and it's what social services system are lacking, like taking in consideration real expertise and knowledge. And I'm very happy to find out more about this recommendation you have presented. So I hope they will have very good positive input furthermore.
Absolutely. It should underpin future legislation. And I agree with you, because I've seen sort of policies come out done by a quick scoping review by some research in the Department of Health and Social Care. And this, to me, this felt like a really rigorous approach to evaluating all the evidence that has been produced. I'm not paid by NICE to say this. It's my it's my own personal view of my experience of being on the guideline committee.
Thank you. Yeah. Any questions for Maria? I actually had one. Oh, sorry.
Yeah. No, you go ahead, Kate.
No, go ahead.
I've said a lot.
No, please go.
It was just you talked, Maria, about how the carers had to go it alone because the support they were having was pulled, or they couldn't access it because of the pandemic. Did you find that they were actually getting any different sort of support because of the pandemic? And the reason I'm asking is that I'm involved with lots of carer centres, and I know that there's been a huge drive to provide a lot of online support in terms of like coffee mornings and online forums. So I was just interested if you found any evidence of that.
Yes, I did, and I volunteered for the Carers Centre myself, and straight away we obviously moved our weekly drop into an online version, and were reflected on that quite a lot, and found that people actually found positives on being online, and they didn't have to find obviously replacement care. They didn't have to negotiate bus routes and get on the bus. It didn't take a long time out of their day. They could drop in. So there's that whole sort of inclusion of people that sometimes would have found it more difficult to be involved in these groups. There's been lots of other things that have come out, lots of creative sort of initiatives. We've got some things running to encourage people to improve their what we would call subjective well-being, improve how they feel by carrying out some crafts and things like that online. But I think it still goes back to that issue, though, of exclusion and inequalities that carers can experience. And I think the whole issue of digital exclusion for carers is a big one. We at the Care Centre we received quite quickly to send people tablets and dongles. And then we had volunteers on the phone ringing through, trying to talk people through who weren't online, trying to talk them through how to join in on the Zooms and things, and to varying degrees of success. So you can chuck as much money and support packages at it, but actually you still need someone to connect with them. You still need someone who's going to be in them regularly, a personal befriend or something. So it's a lot more sort of intensive and more resource intensive than what we were able to provide. But yeah, I think it's like with all of it, isn't it? It's a mixed bag. You can see some real positives. But there's also been, and as we know, an exasperation of existing things, and it's made it harder in many ways. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you very much.
And this links quite nicely into a question I had for Oti around, the feedback she had around technology, and it not necessarily, because in the UK policy discourse, it is sort of being presented as a very much a magic bullet for the health and social care system. And Matt Hancock, who's our Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, handing out 10,000 iPads to care homes without much consideration as to how many of those care homes actually have broadband. Not all of them. Quite a significant amount don't, and without any consideration of, okay, even if they do have broadband, who are those people in the care homes being able to connect to in the community? That question of that Maria has around, is everyone got the right device to be able to connect with someone in a care home with an iPad? But obviously there are drawbacks, but there are positives. The ability to connect with people who maybe can't visit care homes normally because they live on the other side of the world.
So I do agree that people's in-face communication will never cannot be replaced by technology. However, I want to emphasize that for many people, especially with disabilities, gadgets and online communication remain the main tool for socialization, the main tool to fulfill their wishes, for instance, get some education or start new hobby or get new friends. They become very active in online services, and I can definitely see it in the activities. They start organize their group of interests, and surely it cannot be replaced by in-face technology. However, it still remains one of the main tools to avoid social isolation. That is very dangerous for all of us. Isolation in times of the pandemic, anxiety and depression. So you still have the gadget, and you still can be supported and cheer up by people you love and respect and value. So I would not diminish the value of online socialization and online projects. However, I totally agree that for people with dementia, it's another thing. So, and in the context of dementia, technology is still not advanced to be total out of help.
And any other questions or comments? No? Well, I'd just like to thank the panel and Patrick as discussant, and also thank the team that have made this this online session work. Behind the scenes has been a lot of effort gone into, and I'd just like to draw it to a close and thank you all for participating.
Thank you, Kate.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.